Long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japan had already decided it was going to be the undisputed boss of Asia. They looked across the water at China's massive landmass and decided they wanted a piece. They tested the waters during the First Sino-Japanese War and won. Then, while the rest of the world bled out in the trenches of World War I, Japan quietly scooped up even more territory. They were operating like a real estate developer, grabbing land while everyone else was distracted. By the 1920s, Chinese nationalism surged. To maintain their grip, Japan staged a crisis, invaded Manchuria, and installed a puppet state called Manchukuo. It looked independent on paper, but Tokyo held the remote control. When the League of Nations condemned this blatant land grab, Japan didn't apologize. They simply packed up their briefcases and walked out of the organization entirely. Here is the glaring flaw in their strategy. Japan was acquiring thousands of miles of new borders and millions of angry subjects, but they weren't building the domestic economy required to sustain them. They were buying up vast estates without any way to pay the electric bill. In 1937, a localized skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge triggered a massive escalation. Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, pouring infantry and armor into the continent. Their reasoning was entirely extractive. They saw China's enormous geography and population merely as a giant warehouse of raw materials waiting to be harvested for the empire. But this relentless push deeper into the mainland had a side effect they failed to calculate. By brutalizing their neighbors, they caught the hostile attention of the United States and Britain. Japan had constructed one of the most terrifying, resource-hungry military machines on the planet. Yet, they completely ignored the reality that their own home islands held almost none of the raw materials required to keep the engines running. Everything about Japan's sprawling new empire shared one fatal vulnerability. To move ships, planes, and weapons, you need petroleum, and Japan had practically none. The Japanese military and industrial base relied almost entirely on oil imported directly from the very country becoming their biggest rival. But watching the devastation in China, Americans decided they had seen enough, slapping a total embargo on oil exports to Japan. Panic replaced pride in Tokyo. The high-stakes scramble for basic survival had officially begun. The American embargo exposed the hollow core of Japan's strategy. Their intimidating military apparatus was actually a ticking time bomb, and it only had a few months of fuel left before it would freeze entirely. They desperately needed a backup plan, finding it in Southeast Asia. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, was sitting on massive reserves of high-quality crude oil. To justify marching down into Southeast Asia, Japan spun up a brilliant piece of marketing called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The pitch was Asia for Asians, promising to liberate these nations from Western rule. But the locals quickly realized their new liberators were operating exactly like the old colonizers, vacuuming up resources and sending them straight back to Tokyo. By pivoting south, Tokyo drastically raised the stakes. They were now actively moving to hijack the global resource supply chain. Hoping to intimidate the West, Japan looked for heavy hitters to join their team. They signed the Tripartite Pact, officially aligning their military interests with Germany and Italy. America's response was blunt. If Japan wanted the oil taps turned back on, they had to completely withdraw their military forces from China. This diagram illustrates the impossible choice sitting on the emperor's desk. If they withdraw, they lose their conquered lands, their pride, and their status as a major power. If they stay, their military and economy grind to a total halt within a year. Years of aggressive, unchecked expansion had finally caught up with them. The Japanese leadership negotiated themselves into a corner where every peaceful exit door was nailed shut. With their economy suffocating and the clock running out on their strategic reserves, Japan decided there was only one move left to play. They pushed all their chips to the center of the table. Their logic was brutally simple. They needed to launch a massive preemptive strike to permanently cripple the American naval fleet sitting at anchor in Hawaii. This strike aimed to buy just enough time to sweep into Southeast Asia and secure the Dutch oil fields before the American Navy could rebuild. Japan spent decades aggressively redrawing the map of Asia to feed an industrial machine they couldn't power. Ultimately, they dragged the entire planet into a devastating global war for one simple reason: their empire was running out of gas.